Hello everyone, I've just completed my private check ride in the last couple of weeks, and I thought it'd be kind of neat to actually take a couple minutes to discuss some of the things that I learned during the check ride that I probably was not doing right the whole time, but it's just kind of one of those things, and sort of how you can apply it over into Flight Simulator as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So what's the first thing that I learned? The first thing, not so much that I learned, but it was reinforced, is you're probably not taxiing carefully. Now I know that sounds like one of those things where it's like, well, what do you mean by that? Well, the first things first is, let's say, you've got the airplane started, you check your left and you check your right and you start rolling. The first thing you're really supposed to do with an airplane is make sure the brakes work. I know that sounds really dumb and it sounds like something that's obvious, and obviously in a flight simulator it doesn't matter so much because the brakes always work unless you tell them otherwise, but it's just one of those things that you probably want to be mindful of. The next thing we always want to think about during taxiing is not only looking around to make sure we're not about to run into somebody, but that we're maintaining the best speed for the conditions. Now, if you actually look at the regulation for taxiing speed, you'll find out, surprisingly, there's actually no set speeds. Some airports do have set speeds for taxiing, but believe it or not, the speed is supposed to be appropriate for whatever the conditions are. So in our particular case, our conditions are dry, but the traffic is extremely heavy here, which would suggest we want to use a very slow taxiing speed. Now, how slow is slow? The flight instructor wasn't able to give me a straight answer on there, other than no faster than a jog. And obviously, if you're at night or it's in wind or in nasty conditions, we want to make sure we do that correct as well. Another thing that we want to be mindful of when we're taxiing, and this is kind of a big piece, is making sure your controls are in the correct position based on what the wind is in that particular day. So now, if there was a wind directly behind us, what we'd want to do is we want to push our controls and leave them completely alone. We don't want to be pushing them left, right. We just want to leave them completely neutral. If the wind was in front of us, we'd want to pull back a little bit on the controls in order to kind of center it. I always like to say you climb into, dive away from. Now, where it gets interesting is if the wind is hitting us at an angle. Let's say the wind is coming from that direction and looking here. We'd actually want to dip our controls to keep that aileron down into that wind. So if you actually take a look at the situation, you see I've dropped the left aileron. By doing this, I just tilted my control over to that side. If the wind was on the other side, we want to lift that one. Where it gets interesting, though, is if the wind is coming from the direction that I'm looking from right now. That's the situation when you want to basically be getting away from the wind so it doesn't pull you up off the ground. In that case, we're just going to actually tip away from it. Again, climb into, dive away from. So you can see already there's a lot of things. It's like, oh, I just kind of choo-choo along here at maximum speed and it's no big deal. Yeah, you're really not supposed to be flying that fast. And let's say we have a situation just like we have right here. I'm looking at these two guys, waving at each other, who had permission to do what. And we can see this guy immediately starts backing himself up and going kind of nutters there, trying to get the heck out of the way. A lot of this is just stuff. They literally just ran into each other. A lot of this is the kind of stuff you see in flight sim. You're not going to see it as commonly as in the real world, but it's just something to be kind of mindful of. Another thing to remember when you're doing your taxiing, and again, this is just something that was reinforced. Obviously, like I said, I passed the check ride, so things went okay, is making sure that you're not doing anything other than taxiing. Like, I know that sounds obvious again, but it's one of those things where if I'm taxiing and moving this airplane to the ground, my concentration should only be on taxiing and moving this airplane to the ground. If you've got like a radio or something that I need to set, or you need to change the frequency, or you need to look, or even communicating, concentrate on the operation of the airplane first, and then start worrying about everything else that goes around you. Number 2, make sure that any navigation data that you're utilizing is completely up to date, and make sure that you can read it. Now, the reason I've opened this up, you can still hear the airplane kind of buzzing in the background there because I've kind of paused it for a moment, is to actually make sure that whatever document you're using for the purposes of flight planning is good. Some people, of course, will argue, well, according to the feds, you don't actually need to have up-to-date charts in your aircraft. Technically, you don't even need them. You just, quote, basically have to familiarize yourself with the airports and destination that you're traveling to. But the reality is there's so many different things that can happen on these charts that could affect you that you're not even thinking. And one of the downsides to the way that aviation charts are done and aviation navigation is done is it changes so often. You're thinking, oh, it'll just be a quick little, oh, this thing got updated, da-da-da. It's like, no, at the end of the day, you have to know it. And the second thing you want to do is you want to make sure you understand what you're looking at. And now, I know that sounds different. Again, remember, we're talking in the U.S., it's a little different internationally. You want to make sure you know what those colors, circles, and symbols mean. Let me give you a couple quick examples. Coming down here real fast, we notice that we have this beautiful red circle. Here's another beautiful red circle. And we have a red dashed line. We also have this blue, red hazy line. I'm going to call this a magenta. I think is technically the color that they call it. What do those two mean? Okay, you can look here. You're looking at this little parachute symbol. That one's pretty obvious. Do you know what that means? Okay, doing well so far, doing well so far. All right, what's the deal with these little blue dots? Interesting. Poking down here, this little warning zone, restricted zone 4101 Alpha Bravo Charlie. Who controls it? Who do I have to talk to if I want to fly through it? When am I going to be able to fly through it? Another thing to look at, this is one of the nice things about being here, is what does this little thing right here mean? Is there something important about this? Is this relevant to us? Is it something we need to keep an eye out for? Coming up in a different place. Well, let's see if I can find it real quickly here. Up there it is. Scrolling in here. What the heck does RP mean? This is, again, something that you're like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. RP, it means RIP 26 and tree 2. By the way, this means right pattern, in case you're curious about it. So the reason I say this is what's going to happen on a flight is anything that you didn't know what it was is somehow going to come up during that flight. The other thing you're going to note too, and again, this is very relevant for any chart that you're operating. Again, keep it up to date, make sure you know what's on it. But the other thing you want to watch out for is things that you can't see on the chart, which may be helpful to you. Let me explain. So let's say we're flying from Hartford and we're cruising down here. We'll make it to Groton, London, kind of along this direction. How easy is it going to be to see Salmon River Airport? Okay, did you notice that there's a bunch of lakes here? How are you going to identify which one of those lakes is the lake you want? Is there something that's intersecting? Is there something along those lines? Are you going to be able to see it? What if the visibility is eliminated? You want to be thinking about all of these things and being ready for it, because what will happen is your perfect little VFR flight plan will get spoiled by something that does not actually go down. And then we have the next one. This is the number 3. Looking around. Now, you're probably sitting there going, why? I'm looking around all the time. I've got all my fancy pants equipment that's going to tell me exactly where I am at all times. Believe it or not, one of the things about flight simulator pilots, and this is something I was told many years ago. This is like back in 2010. I remember one of my first flight instruction things that I ever received. And basically, the pilot that I was flying with says, you must do a lot of flight sims. And I'm like, okay. And he basically said, I can tell this because of the fact that you're not spending enough time looking around. And it's just one of those things where in a flight sim, your view is more or less, it's not that it's fixed forward, but it's, you spend a lot of time doing the view that I'm doing right now. Now, some people have things like Track IR, and a lot of you probably run things in VR, and I completely agree that that makes it a little bit easier. But even then, you're probably spending too much time concentrating on instruments and not enough time looking around for things like traffic or surprises that might be coming along your way. So how did we facilitate this? What does this look like when you're in the real world? Well, in the real world, just like when you drive in a car, when you're always constantly looking back over your mirrors and things like that, you never just point at the road and go. You're constantly looking on your left, you're constantly looking on your right, you're constantly doing one of these things. Now, one of the reasons I picked the 152 for this video today is because it has a very distinctive blind spot, and that is that large wing that you see chilling right there. I can't see through that wing. I can look up to it all the time. So one of the problems we face is when you want to take a turn, again, this is just an example here. Let's say I want to pop onto a base on for 1.8 right there. It's actually safer to lift up, look, and then execute your turn than it is to actually go ahead and execute a regular turn. If we did not do that, we would miss anything that was right above us that could be turning into us. The other thing, too, is you can see I'm kind of leaning up against the dashboard here to get a better view out the front nose, is constantly scanning where we're going, where we're coming from. Because if I go like this, and now that I can see and there's something coming, I need to know that that's there in order to respond to it appropriately. One of the interesting stories I have from the actual Checkride, other than basically getting whacked over the head with a newspaper for not looking enough, is the fact that we did have a lot of traffic when we were doing our landings. And during this particular experience, one of the things that I had spotted was some traffic coming our way. Now, that person in the traffic did something a little on the naughty side. They basically asked the traffic, us, that would have been myself included, what are you up to? Rather than listening to the radio and determining what was there. But now the interesting reason that's so fascinating is he did this when he was about 5 or 6 nautical miles away from the airport itself. Now you're probably saying, well, that's not that big a deal. You had plenty of time to respond. Now imagine if I were concentrating and trying to carefully land this plane and he happened to be a little bit late or a little bit earlier and missed my initial radio call. You'd suddenly run into a situation where we would basically run right into each other because they're all going to be using the same runway that day. So again, being able to look around and being mindful of your surroundings is one of the most critical components. Now, it gets actually a little bit more interesting than that as well, and I will demonstrate that as we get it on the ground here. I gotta love this 152. It's just, it just goes. Like, I'm at complete idle right now, and I could probably land in the first 5 feet of the runway. It's a magical airplane in that regard. All my primary flight training was done in Warriors and 172s, in case you're curious. But look at this. You just point at the ground. Oh man, this thing is a vacation to land. I love it. Not a very heavy airplane, and you really got to like the person you're sitting next to when you fly it. And we're just going to keep going. Again, look around. Did somebody pull into the runway at the last second? You can't be doing that tunnel vision thing because that could be downright dangerous. All right, let's go settle down. Nice. Which brings me to my next point about looking around. Now I'm going to come up to the end of this runway. Let's see how, I want a little wide kind of a thing like that here. I'm going to go ahead and tap the brakes, give it a little bit of force. Now let's say that there's somebody using runway 27. Again, we'll pick on that chap there that we decided to use earlier. Before we cross this runway, even if we know that everybody's gone, we still should be looking to make sure there's nobody on that runway that we're using. The reason we want to do that is, of course, people might be not paying attention. People might be coming in. Maybe there's an emergency. Maybe there's somebody on an instrument flight plan. And again, we need to be looking where we're going and what could possibly hit us at any time. Now, when you're flying on instrument flights, a lot of people are like, well, that won't be so bad. I mean, you just obviously rely on the instruments. That doesn't guarantee that other people are on the same channel as you, the same level of awareness. And by the way, notice how I'm taxiing much too fast. But again, I'm trying to promote this for demonstration. Now, my last piece about looking around, I'm actually going to demonstrate right here at the end of this little taxiway here. And that's the fact that when you're getting ready for takeoff, especially if you're in an uncontrolled airport, you have to know where other people are. Like I said, I've been saying this a lot for the last 3 minutes or so. But the reason I want to say this is, again, it goes back to the fact that this aircraft has a really nasty blind spot. This is much too quick of a taxi. If you see the airspeed indicator move, that's usually a safe bet that you're probably going a bit fast. Now, normally what we do is we come over here, we line ourselves up with this lovely little taxiway right at the end and do one of these things. And I'll show you what's going to happen. And I'll stop right here. Perfect. All right, let's see if there's any... Oh. So again, one of the downsides is I can't see the oncoming traffic. So when you do this, a safer bet to do it is instead of stopping there, stop here. Because now what I can do is I can just look up like this, and I can spot any traffic. Then I can pop onto the runway and safely look down. Number 4, checklists. So now on a real aircraft, obviously you've got a little plastic piece of paper that you keep in this little kind of envelope here. You pull it out, you start reading it out, and you check it. So when you do a checklist every time, regardless of what the item is that you're checking. So for example, if I do 30 takeoffs, theoretically, that's 30 times looking at the before takeoff checklist. It's not something you do in the beginning. You're like, good to go, and we don't worry about it for the rest. So grab my checklist. We're doing it before takeoff here. Parking brake is set. We're just going to confirm that real quick, which it is, so I don't have to worry about that. Nice. We're going to make sure the fuel shut off valve is good. Mixture rich. Mixture is going to be rich. The strobe light needs to be turned on. Aha! That's why we check every time. We're going to make sure the parking brake is released. That's it. Carburetor heat cold. It is. Full throttle. Elevator control. Lift nose wheel at 50 knots. Checklist complete. Now, the value of that checklist is every single time you do it, just the act of doing it is going to make it easier to remember in the event that something weird happens during takeoff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an emergency during takeoff, and we're just going to walk through it. So they said we're going to go ahead and make sure everything's good, trim's good, everything's ready to rock. Go ahead and give it full throttle. And remember, we're going to lift the nose when we get to 50 miles an hour. I've completed my entire checklist. Everything was perfectly good. We're now ready to rock. Now, this is where it's going to get interesting. So ripping down this runway 18, which I got to be very acquainted with during my check ride. It says lift the wheel at 50. We lift the nose, engine failure. Now, the reason I did that is because there was no time in the universe to get to that checklist. So even though the checklist was wonderful, when we had time to act on the checklist during an emergency, you have to fly the plane. They always jokingly say ABC. You want to make sure airspeed is correct. You want to make sure that you've picked a place on the ground to go, and then you reach out for the checklist. So again, very valuable lesson there as well. And now for the final thing that I learned. This is number 5, in case you're keeping score, not that I'm showing it digitally. And that is the importance of having altitude. Now, it's one of those things where, we kind of take it for granted in a flight sim that everything works all the time. When we're cruising around here, I really don't have to be concerned with anything other than getting terribly lost, which I'm sure everybody in Flight Simulator has done at least 50 times just this week. But the importance of having altitude is basically, if there's some kind of in-flight emergency and we need to get on the ground, the more altitude we have, the more time we have to respond. Let me show you what I mean. Oh, engine failure. Shoot. Okay, ABC. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get ourselves to our best glide immediately. And I'm going to start looking around for somewhere where we're going to put this thing down on the ground. There's some pretty good fields over there. I don't mind that too much. Again, pick a spot. Those are power lines. It's going to end terribly for us. I'm going to go back to our 60 knots here. There's a runway right off my nose right there. That looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and give myself enough trim. And since we're in a 152, I'm pretty confident that we're actually going to make it all the way down to that runway. If it doesn't work, we got Route 2 right there on my left. I also know a really good pizza joint off Route 2, so probably after this incredible stressful affair, we'll go ahead and land on that, go get some pizza, and then probably call the feds to let them know that I almost crashed the plane. So now let's take a look at the exact same scenario. Let's go right here. But this time what we're going to do is we're going to lower altitude to, let's say, the traffic pattern altitude of where we were flying to. So let me go ahead and put that nose down. I'll put ourselves back up to cruise power here. And the traffic pattern at that airport that we're flying towards is about 1,018 feet. So I'm going to pop us all the way down to 1,018 feet here. That looks pretty good right there. Cool. Go give myself plenty of trim. All right, looking pretty good, looking pretty good. Engine out. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to immediately pitch to get our 60 knots, and we're going to find a place to land. Okie dokie then. Place to land. Place to land. Oh my god, those power lines look pretty good. The best I got, I guess, is Route 2. All right, unfortunately, we're going to miss our exit here. So we want to do standard rate turns in an emergency. There's my standard rate, 60 knots. We're just going to very, very gently glide and hope we don't die. So you can see the difference of 2,000 feet was the difference between being able to basically land on a runway and finding a highway and hoping that I get the right exit here, because the last thing I want to do is hit one of those underpasses or under overpasses. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at one right here. So hopefully this video was helpful and gave you the opportunity to kind of see a little bit of some of the things that I honestly take for granted because, I spend so much time flying the plane and not enough time actually thinking about flying the plane. It's kind of one of those things where, what do you do when it doesn't go well? Many of us can land the planes. Many of us can land pretty much any plane. Many of us can operate every single avionic on the plane. But the reality is when things get interesting, you want to make sure that you've set yourself up for success and not set yourself up in such a way that that little tiny thing that you weren't thinking about is going to end up being the thing that's probably going to make you crash. Like in this particular case, I don't think I can get this aircraft underneath that bridge. And I know better than to try to extend my base and put myself into a death spin here. I've not touched my flaps yet. Yep, this would certainly be interesting. Oh boy, there's a bridge. Well, this is going to be the end of this flight. The flaps all the way down. I guess I'll execute a slip. Landing against traffic is a sure way to die, but unfortunately I don't really have a choice here. Hey guys. Hey, mind if I join you? Woohoo! Brakes, brakes, brakes. Oh my god, emergency brakes, brakes! I don't think I'm gonna survive. In the real world, bridges are a little more solid. So hopefully this video is helpful to you and just kind of passes on some of the wisdom that I've gained and works out. Enjoy.